The Columbian Exchange is a term coined, which is a way of saying invented or made up in the last 50 years. It refers to the massive transfer, this giant swapping of everything from plants and animals to people, culture, ideas, and most unfortunately, disease between the old world and the new world after Columbus. So we're talking late 15th century through the 16th century. Now, New World should make some sense given that we've talked about Columbus, but Old World, of course, means everything that was known in the world prior to Columbus. So the world was known to be Africa, Asia, Europe. And especially in this context, Old World, we mostly mean Europe to some extent, like the west coast of Africa, the Middle East, and so on. So even though this is history, let's talk for a minute about geology and geography. Let's put that hat on. It's important to know that prior to 200 million years ago, Africa as well as the Americas were part of a giant landmass. And starting about 200 to 175 million years ago, it naturally began breaking apart. And so what was once one separated in a process known as continental drift. So several tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years is ample enough time in evolutionary terms for new animals and new plants to emerge, and that they did. So in that time, wheat, which wasn't around in the New World, but was central to the invention of agriculture in the Old World, emerged. By contrast, corn and potatoes, which are really important to a lot of diets and cuisines all around the world now, only existed in the New World. And chocolate, which almost all of us love, if you lived in Europe in 1491 or anywhere else before Columbus, you didn't even know what that was because cocoa beans weren't yet discovered by the outside world. And cocoa beans, of course, is what is used to make chocolate. Another example is animals. Horses were the main form of transportation in a lot of ways on land in the old world. The New World didn't have that. Now, interestingly, evolution had kind of invented a creature very similar to horses in South America at one point, but of course, they weren't horses, and they weren't used the same way. It was the explorers who introduced horses to the New World, which the natives started using and riding, but that was a new thing. So, unfortunately, this early example of what we now call globalization, and globalization is a word meaning the world becoming increasingly connected through trade, had a very grim, tragic downside as terrible diseases were introduced to the New World and to a lesser extent the Old World. The Old World apparently got syphilis from the New World. But apart from that, all of the disease inflicted by the Europeans, it was all a one-way street. And so Native Americans, the indigenous who had no familiarity, meaning their bodies hadn't produced any immunities to these terrible diseases, were caught completely off guard. So these epidemics of things like smallpox and measles, etc., we'll get further into the diseases and into the reasons why they spread. They killed off 99% of the original population of the Caribbean. By 1650, the populations plummeted, depending on where you were, between 50 and 95% in the Americas. One very stark example is when the Spanish arrived in Mexico in 1519, the population was estimated to be 15 to 30 million people. By the end of that century, just 80 years later, fewer than 2 million left. Some of this was violence. The vast majority of it were diseases. It was unintentional spreading, a viral infection that just wiped people out.